Hey everybody, welcome back. We are in the third week of January, which means we've only got a little bit more time left in the month, and we'll see when the season wraps up. And I really just wanted to get a video out there to kind of take stock of the last month. My last meta video was, I think, in December, right? And we are we're almost in February now, so I just felt like we had to put a little bit more content on the channel that was giving some folks some direction and just some practical thoughts on whatever your goal is for either hitting Mythic, getting high up into Mythic. And I wanted this video to really just be able to give a bit more information specifically about where my head's at when climbing at the moment. As you can see, we're top 40. We're definitely not doing a ton of grinding. Been doing a lot of that event, to get materials. And hopefully everyone's been able to do that themselves for whatever comes next, whether that's specific cards we want for the next Planeswalker. Feel free to check out that video on the channel. And please don't forget to like and subscribe and comment. I love hearing from the community, no matter what it is. It's just really a great thing to get those notifications. And speaking of community, if you did not get a chance to see, Logan Thorne just put up his video about his community tournament that him and his, co-Discord MTG Spellslingers friend put up, Tunnel, for the community. And thank you everyone who participated. I had a lot of fun. No spoilers, but that last match definitely taught me a ton about that matchup. We'll probably even talk a little bit about it today. So definitely go over to his channel at Logan Thorne and check out some, I think, really great games. And I think it's actually a really good showcase because Teferi shows up a lot in it, to really start this conversation for today, because I want to go over three specific Planeswalkers and talk about what I'm feeling, because we had a meta video up in December. It's almost February now, right? And not a ton has shifted in terms of, like, there are no new cards. There haven't been like any very emergent, new strategies to talk about. But there's definitely fine tuning that's gone on. And in my opinion, instead of Ral kind of being the menace on the ladder back in December, we're looking at Teferi kind of menacing the ladder. And a Planeswalker that I think a lot of, at least Team MTGSS, has come to feel is incredibly resilient to basically any strategy. And those are my individual thoughts as well. So I think without further ado, let's just dive into Teferi, talk a little bit about him, and we're going to talk about two other Planeswalkers too that I think, are really the top three strategies when I am going to go and try and hit, at least top 20. That's probably what I'm looking to do. So I want to talk about two builds, but I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the proactive build, which is more built for the mirror, which I reverse engineered from a couple of games that I played against people, and a couple other folks who had shared thoughts in the community Discord about the mirror. But I would say the pretty common Teferi build you might find is something like this, right? So, runs some of these cheaper traps like Shield Up, Disorient, maybe a mix of like Guess Again, Snapshell, Turtle, right? And I think if you literally just booted up this list and maybe tweaked, I think I had played with a couple numbers. You're gonna do well. You're gonna climb in Mythic. You're gonna win games. It's just a really really powerful Planeswalker and strategy at the moment. I had even tweaked the numbers because like Day of Judgment has felt less important in my opinion. Sure, you're gonna run into the decks where you really need it, but I felt like Second Sun's Dawn is actually more relevant for control mirrors to put an extra card in your deck to not mill yourself out. And sometimes, like, on turn 6, you can slam that. You don't even need to Day of Judgment the next turn. So I had played with some of the numbers. And one other card I'll mention too, which I think people should consider not playing, is Hatchet Plans. Now, obviously, it's a lot of card advantage, and that's great, but it's kind of just doesn't do enough, in my opinion. It's also yes, you can cheapen the this the cost if you're running like wizard class or something like that, but just being a 4 mana spell, like this deck just wants to sit there kind of stop the ground if that's where your opponent's trying to beat you. Sit back and just play traps here and there, accrue card advantage, and just grind you down, and then maybe slam an Arcanus and just close the door. Right, in most matchups. It doesn't really pertain to control. So just having a card like this, it doesn't really play into this sort of pass go kind of play style of Teferi. And even when you're trying to be proactive, I just don't think it's the best spell to do that. That's just some of the talk on the team we've also been sharing with each other. So this is what I would call the standard list, and I think it's perfectly fine. I think you could tweak numbers here and there depending on what you're seeing, and that's what's incredible about Teferi is just because the traps, although they can be narrow in some ways, you can adjust the numbers and really give yourself the advantage to adjust to basically anything in the meta. And I think Pixie Trickster, I also want to mention, is just kind of an all-star, especially playing in a meta with Liliana. It turns their big dumb zombie into a 3/3 frog and essentially denies them the ability to get that zombie back. And in long drawn-out games, that's just a huge advantage for you. And sometimes, with Snapshell turtle builds, you can even beat your control opponent down. But I don't think, the emphasis on shields up or disorient is really where Teferi needs to be for the current meta, because aggro's not even really there, right? I will play against Nahiri here and there. I'll play against Gideon once in a while. Maybe Angrath, I would say, shows up the most for me. But you just have so many tools to deal with aggro that I think it makes sense to shift to the build we're going to talk about. But again, I'll post this deck list as well in the comments below, the deck code. You feel free to fire this up. You're going to do well with it. But I think for those who are a little bit more deep in the meta when it comes to playing against other Teferis, I think this version is really cool. Now, I've played, I would say, maybe 10 games overall, and it's definitely been mostly positive. And I think in the mirror, I have felt very clearly ahead of my opponent in those situations. And I've even tweaked a little bit of the builds as of today, playing more games. So this is really coming very fresh with my perspective here. And the first thing we have to talk about is School of the Wizard, right? When we're running traps instead of spells, and we're not just hard casting things, why would we be playing this card? But this card has a lot more value than what you would think when you're initially looking at it. And so aside from having a 2/2 body that can reduce your Day of Judgment or your Second Sun's Dawn, or potentially even Shell Game, really what this card allows you to do is have more cards in your deck, right, which is very relevant in the control matchup, but specifically the Teferi Mirror. B, it gives you another free spell, which could sometimes, the modality of the signature spells can really help you in a tough spot. And obviously Elemental Mastery is kind of the biggest standout, right? Paying 6 mana to make a 5/4 sneak that in future turns, when your Day of Judgment, using Day of Judgment, when you're using Second Sun's Dawn, when you're combining a Shell Game with potentially another spell, you're just getting free value, right? And obviously in mid-range, it's incredibly powerful, but I think this card and the way the build is really lends itself to beating out your opponent in the mirror. Because traditional Teferi decks don't run a class card for the most part. So that's the first thing. And I would say, if you're skeptical, I understand it. When I first saw it and played against it, I was like, I don't know if that's that good. Maybe I should just run a copy of Dupe, right? The 1 mana that copies a spell, and I'll just copy my opponent's Elemental Mastery, which I think is a viable strategy. But I think I wanted to have a control deck that felt just a little bit more able to pressure, while also not giving up the cards that it needs to beat other matchups, and just having the best possible card advantage for the mirror. And that's why we're going to talk about this next spell, Resilient Sphere. Now, it's incredibly narrow, right? If your opponent plays a legendary creature, counter it. But what is the one legendary creature that you care about when you're playing Teferi versus Teferi? It is our fine friend Arcanus the Archmage, and if this spell resolves, you should win the game. Now, there were games I actually had today and yesterday where Arcanus did resolve and I still won, and we'll talk about how we got there. But having this as a one of, I think, is just where we should be moving if Teferi is the menace and we want to beat Teferi in the mirror match. Because this only hits this one spell, right? I mean, maybe there's a chance they've gotten a random legendary card from, like, if they're running the legendary land. So I guess maybe in that matchup that would be bad. But pretty much every Teferi deck runs Sacred Sanctum. And who knows, maybe there's an opportunity to look there and say, is that the right land, right? As things shift more towards a mid-range control meta, maybe we don't really need our land giving us life. Maybe we do want extra cards from something else, or maybe we just want to run a land that doesn't stop our curve. You know, that's something that Logan Thorne talks a lot about, is like, if you're running lands that aren't really adding that much value to your deck, you should just run a regular land so you're not missing your land drops, right? But I do think there's enough aggro slash scaling up mid-range decks in the meta still that Sacred Sanctum does enough work. But again, I just want to go back to, I haven't personally gotten to play as much with this card, but let me tell you, when I get blown out by it, it feels really bad. And I think the first cut I made was one of the Disorients. And Disorient is a cheap, really efficient interactive trap against creatures, but this card is absolutely abysmal in the mirror matchup, in my opinion, right? It has some applications, but to me, I'd much rather have a 1-mana counterspell to their 8-drop than a 1-mana give something -3/-0. So that was kind of my thinking for how I started to change the deck around. Runeshell Crab, I think, is still kind of a necessary evil. Just a really efficient defensive creature. It does exactly what you need it to do in all of the non-control matchups. So I don't really think you should be cutting that. We'll see. I cut the second Disorient. Maybe that's wrong. I have an inkling if we're going to try and tune towards the mirror, I think we should not be playing to that card. Leonin Healer, again, kind of in the same thing as Runeshell Crab. It's just a necessary evil. It's a 2/3 for 2, very efficient body that heals you for 3. And just there are a lot of matchups where that's pretty relevant. Vindictive Shot, just obviously very cheap, very good. Your life total's already hugely padded, so the fact that you can just take hits and then kill their creature for 2 mana, just incredibly powerful. And now we got to talk about the All-Star, Snapcaster Mage. When I saw this in another Teferi build, I was immediately really interested. And what's cool about this card is that you can really kind of plan ahead with it, right? And the interactions it has specifically with School of the Wizard is, sure, if you played a signature spell and then you play Snapcaster Mage, marking this, you can get another signature spell. But the real advantage is getting another Elemental Mastery, right? So that you can just get 1,000,000 water elementals. However, I want to caveat this by saying that's kind of a win more, right? That's not always going to be, the thing that actually matters. Like, what matters about Snapcaster is it's essentially, in some cases, able to put an extra card in your deck. And I would say the best interaction between Snapcaster and any spell is Second Sun's Dawn. Now, if you've played Teferi in the control matchup, you know why it's important to have more cards in your deck. But for those who have not played this matchup that much, I would say 9 times out of 10, when I'm playing against Teferi, whoever just kind of spews out their traps the most, even if they're landing some of their spells, is going to deck first. And really the only spell that matters to interact with is Arcanus, quite frankly. I guess you could say Second Sun's Dawn, but 10 damage, even once or twice, is not going to kill you when you're at like 40 life, right, from having Sacred Sanctum and going to like 20 turns. So really the only thing that matters that can give you the most important spell, which is Riddling Arcana, for the Sphinxes that mill you when they attack. That's really all that can turn the tide. But if your opponent's just like, aside from It's Live, just throwing out negates here and there, using Disorients on maybe your 2/3, which you can bait out, or Vindictive Shots, they're just drawing extra cards that doesn't actually do anything for them because you're not really, establishing certain board presence. Like in some ways, yes, you are, because you're using School of the Wizard and getting elementals and things like that. But or playing like an It's Alive where they're like, okay, well, I need to answer that. That's true. Yeah, you want to be playing Vindictive Shot and Immolating Glare. But oftentimes, if you even just put a couple creatures down, people will prep traps, and it just doesn't matter. All it's doing is giving them less turns to work with. So I think it is a bit of a dance, and I have not mastered it clearly from the fact that I'm not number one. I don't have a million Teferi games under my belt like one of my teammates, Teleria, who's played I think 100 Teferi games or more. But I can tell you, having played this particular build and played the mirror, more than a few times, you don't want to just be drawing cards kind of willy nilly. It's really just particular cards that you need. So, sorry, that was a long aside. Anyway, Snapcaster Mage is an excellent card, and the specific interaction of playing Second Sun's Dawn, and if it resolves, so potentially having 3 or potentially 4 copies in your deck, you're getting 2 additional cards in your deck, right? And that could be really relevant. And sometimes when you're playing against Liliana, who we're going to talk about today, you need more shell games, right? And you can be like, well, I haven't played a single spell this game, and I've got Snapcaster sitting in my hand. Great. I'm going to shell game their first threat, and then I'm going to play Snapcaster, shell game their second threat. They're super behind, right? So this card just does a crazy amount of work in this build. Negate, just absolutely an all-star right now. And I think if you're playing the mirror, you just got to know there's basically no reason to throw out Negate unless you're trying to resolve Elemental Mastery on maybe turn 8, or trying to resolve Arcanus, right? So like you just basically never want to prep this trap in the mirror until like turn 10 potentially. It's Alive is just the perfect card, and I think I've learned a lot about how to play with this card where, basically here and there you're maybe baiting out some traps or baiting out some interaction from your opponent, and then you just get to a point where like your opponent is like trying to figure out how to apply pressure to you, and just on like 6, 7, 8, 9 mana, you just play this as the one trap that turn because you don't really need to interact any other way. And now you have a threat that they have to answer. Now, I will caveat It's Alive's efficacy by saying there are ways to bounce the token, right? And then it just completely resets the zombie. It's just a 2/2 for 2. So like Unsummon and Mistраven are pretty good answers to It's Alive. So don't think that you're just going to get off scot-free when you only play this as like, a potential win condition. So just kind of be mindful with that. But It's Alive you really just want to play when you have a good amount of mana. They are not applying a ton of pressure, and maybe they're even prepping their own traps or own interaction, and you can just kind of get them for a huge swing to potentially close out the game. So that's kind of how that works. Teferi Staff, just especially in the mirror, if you get the Devil Trap, the 4-mana Devil Trap, you just should win the mirror because you can have like kind of infinite devil creatures being put into your deck, so you'll never deck. And there are also some other really relevant traps that you get off Teferi Staff. And I think when we've been talking as a team, Teferi Staff seems like potentially the most kind of unfair card in the deck, just because it is a 2 for 2, but the traps obviously grow your card advantage lead because that's contributing to your passive. And just being able to have access to traps that your opponent cannot account for because there's so much hidden information, it's just really hard to know. Like, you can't afford to play around anything. That's almost like how you have to treat Teferi when you're playing mid-range matchups. Like, maybe here and there you can try and bait out an Immolating Glare, but for the most part, you kind of just have to be proactive and hope it works out. Immolating Glare, still a really necessary card, especially if you're playing against School of the Wizard, because it's one of the best ways to answer the elementals. Absorb, nothing to explain there, you need to play it. Teferi's Acolyte, just still a good defensive body that cheapens your, kind of hides the cost of some of your traps. Shell Game, it's just really important to have this card in your deck in a Liliana meta, in my opinion. So I think even Lilianas themselves play it, from what I know. I forget if I have it in my build, but that's something definitely to consider. Second Sun's Dawn, I almost think is better than Day of Judgment, but if you're playing School of the Wizard, you should play both, right? Because it's just 1, 2, 3, 4 procs for your Elemental Mastery, right? So, And sometimes Day of Judgment is incredibly clutch, and it's exactly what you need. Sometimes Second Sun's Dawn is just enough life that they can't really, get past your defenses, and it's even sometimes more effective than Day of Judgment because it costs less, right? And what's great is you're running Wizard Familiar, and it gets to cheapen your Second Sun's Dawn and Day of Judgment, which is excellent. And then the last thing, Arcanus is in every Teferi build. This is the card you should take note of. This is the way that they can close out the game in most matchups, and specifically in the mirror match. This spell, it just matters so much because, again, like Snapcaster Mage, it is a card that is giving you more cards in your deck, and that's just so, so important. And it's also giving you potential alternate win conditions, right? And what's great is it's giving you 3 spells that can potentially help trigger your Elemental Mastery. So, and sorry for my voice again, I'm definitely coming down with something, but I wanted to put this up there, so bear with me here. Might just grab some water, actually. So that's kind of the list. And I think, ooh, that helped. And I call it proactive even though you still play a control list, because I just think School of the Wizard makes me think proactive, right? Because I'm playing spells to trigger it, the Elemental Mastery. Also, I'll be straight up honest, Teferi is so boring to me. Playing that Planeswalker was never that appealing to me. This deck appeals to me because I feel like I can sort of set the tempo. I can choose which counter battles to fight. I can choose which counter, which times I want to play It's Alive versus using Second Sun's Dawn or Day of Judgment. I just feel like I have a bit more agency with the deck, even if it's maybe a trade-off here or there. I generally feel like I'm able to pilot this deck a little bit more effectively, if that makes sense. But there are plenty of other people who are running other builds, and I just think this is the deck for the mirror. This is the deck if you like playing with School of the Wizard. I'm sure there are things that could, be changed, but I've been really, really happy with this list. So my general thought, as you probably took away from however many minutes it's already been, is that Teferi is incredibly powerful, and to me, is the deck to beat at the moment. Aggro doesn't have the tools to do it. Mid-range doesn't really have the tools to do it. The only one that seems to have the tools to do it is Teferi himself, which is really probably not the healthiest place, for this Planeswalker to be when we think about deck diversity. But had to talk about this deck just because this Planeswalker, I think, is the best Planeswalker right now in the game. And yeah, you're going to lose some games, but I think overall you'll find that even when you're starting to get the hang of the deck, it just is incredibly powerful and interactive, but also just you're able to outplay your opponents, especially in the control mirrors in a lot of different ways. I'll say my brief anecdote is even when my opponent's Arcanus made it through my counters and they had enough negates to interact with me, they were down like 5 or 6 cards because they had just been kind of spewing off their different traps. And it's not like they were misplaying necessarily, right? I don't think it's a misplay to want to be like, okay, I'm going to dig and find my Arcanus, I'm going to resolve it, and then I should win the game. But when you have 40 life and you're up on cards, it doesn't really matter when your opponent starts applying pressure to you. You're not going to have enough time, generally speaking, to close it out. And I would say, even if Arcanus resolves, the only thing you have to worry about is this spell, Riddling Arcana, because it mills you. So as long as you've still got your spare negate for Mystical Arcana or Absorb, that's important. And sorry, my last note, and I promise we're going to move on here, is that when you're playing against Teferi, mirror match or not, you should be looking at the log, the game log, the combat log as I like to call it, because I'm an old WoW player. You should be keeping track of how many traps they've played. Okay, they've played 1 negate and 1 absorb so far, right? Or they've played 1 vindictive shot, an immolating glare, and a disorient, right? Like, you can, it's annoying, I will say, but you can use the combat log to give you some information of like, these are the cards, these are the traps, and how many remain in their deck. And that does give you some level of information. So if you ever see me playing this, whether that's in a YouTube video, which I probably will get out this week to y'all, you're going to see me checking that, especially in the mirror match, because it's just free information that's important for you to have. So that is Teferi. We've said enough about this man. let's definitely move on to a deck that I've been playing, and I'll be honest, I don't think it's for me, but a lot of people have found a lot of success in, as this deck is aptly named Tino, because for those of you in the community who know Tino, he's pretty active in Logan's Discord, as well as on Team MTG SS. This has been their kind of like go-to deck for, I think, the last month and a half, and I think Tina's really just done some serious innovating, serious like ability to make the deck more consistent. And that's what this deck needs, because my main critique of playing Liliana is I think she's still an incredibly powerful deck against the entire field, right? But my beef with her is that you can just get these really awful hands, even when you're mulliganing, where like you draw all of your cheap traps against a control matchup, or you draw all of your high costing things, but you don't have like a bag of devouring to like get rid of it, and it just I'm gonna go through the list because I don't want to assume everyone knows exactly what this deck's doing, but it just can have some really garbage hands, and that's something that I just struggle with and really dislike. But I still think that the deck is incredibly powerful, and there's definitely room for different cards to be in here. Um, so let's go through it because I don't want to assume everyone knows. But the main strategy for this deck, right, is dump a big creature like Grimgrin, who's incredibly powerful at like stealing one of their weakest creatures and giving you a 2/2 when it's brought back from a graveyard, or killed and then comes back with Relentless. And Soul Sever Lich particularly, dealing half of your opponent's damage and giving it sneak with Silent Strike usually will kill your opponent, right? I think if they're at 25 or 26, 20, I think it's at 28 life is the break point, I believe, right? Because half of 25 and it's rounded. What is it? It's rounded up. Yeah. So I believe it's 28. That's the break point. You basically just kill your opponent in one attack. That's kind of like the whole deal. But what you have to do in this deck is you have to make it consistent enough to not just lose to aggressive decks, which I do think is kind of its weakness, although this build addresses some of that. And also you have to find ways of outplaying your Teferi matchup, which we were just talking about, and that's why you'll already spy 2 copies of Negate in here. But let's go through it. And I do think Tino has kind of gone back and forth on playing either Old Graveyard or the Yawgmoth's Portal. Is that what it is? It's the one where you get an empty mana gem and a free legendary. I do think that Old Graveyard is a little bit more consistent. I think it's kind of more what you want to be doing. I don't even know that you need to run a land in particular, but I think probably Old Graveyard makes the most sense. So let's start with a card that, to be honest, I did not know existed until fairly recently. Break a Leg. 1 mana, after your opponent summons a creature, give it -2/-2. And something else I didn't quite connect is that if a creature has a debut trigger and it dies to Break a Leg, counters the debut trigger. Like, it just doesn't happen, right? So if you play the 3/2 from Drist that makes something legendary, it just dies and the trigger doesn't happen. So like that's something that's pretty relevant, and obviously this is really good against 2 drops, 3 drops, that kind of thing. Grave Disturbance. I think people have come off. I think at one point these lists were running 2 of them. Now I think 1 is probably fine, but like Break a Leg tends to be a little bit better than having a 2/2, like giving something -2/-2 and potentially countering a debut trigger tends to be a lot more powerful. Anticipate, you just need to be running because you gotta find the pieces that you need, right? So being able to look at 3 cards and determine that is really, really important. Oh, going through it. We're doing it. We're gonna get this video done. Zombify, obviously just your all-star cheap reanimation spell. It even lets you draft, which is incredibly relevant because with Fearsome Return, it says strongest creature, and depending on what is in your graveyard first, Grimgrin versus Soul Sever Lich, and when it comes back, sometimes you can't choose, right? And instead of wanting, Soul Sever Lich, it'll give you Grimgrin. So the ability to choose the Zombify, and just for how cheap it is, right? It's 2 mana instead of 5. It's just really, really important to the strategy. And of course, it's Liliana's signature card. Drain Blood, just always a reasonable concession to the aggro decks, but also the Drain 2 is pretty relevant into like stuff like Ral. So I think it's still like worth playing. when I think about the meta and how little aggressive decks there are, I tend to trim those first. But I think this deck just needs extra. It needs to pad its life total. It needs to be able to interact with the board early. Otherwise, unless you're having just the nut draw every single game, which is definitely not possible from my experience, you're going to have problems. Divination, I think there used to be 2 copies, but I think with Negate kind of being the necessary evil to put in the deck, you can only afford to have 1, because Grimgrin counts as your 6th blue card for the blue splash. Nothing to see here, right? Corpse Conveyor just mills the top creature from your deck and summon a zombie. It's just what you need to get Grimgrin and Soulsucker Lich in your yard. We'll talk about Grave Titan. We're almost there. So that's, when you start on the draw and you have the empty mana gem and you do this on turn 2, and then you just follow it up with a Zombify, that's when your opponent's probably going to sigh and potentially leave the game. That is Liliana's, biggest asset, I would say. Transparent Hallway, I think, is just a good one of. It's good into those mid-range decks, but it's just not, it's not a card you really love drawing all the time. Bag of Devouring, I will say, helps with the deck's consistency. When you start your opening hand with this and, a Grave Titan and a Soulsucker Lich, it's really good to be able to pitch, one of those cards away and draw a free card. There's definitely sequences where someone will bounce your big zombie off the board, and you could just Bag of Devouring it, and then Zombify it again. So it really prevents bounce from being as backbreaking against Liliana as it would seem. Fest. So in this list, there's 1. And again, I think that is a nod to we're not playing against many aggressive decks. If you are, probably want 2 Infest. But if you're not, I think 1 Infest is fine. And something to note that I had done in this deck, which I think is a cool interaction, is sometimes you want your Grimgrin to die, right? Because you want to get the Relentless trigger to take one of their creatures. And oftentimes you'll be fighting for board position, and then you're like, wow, if I can just remove their last creature with a Grimgrin proc, that would be great. But maybe they're playing smart, and they're blocking so that Grimgrin doesn't die. You can use Infest to help your Grimgrin along there into an early grave, right? By giving it -2/-2, and then having it come back. So don't miss that line of play when you're playing this deck. Silent Strike, incredibly clunky, awkward, terrible card, but it's obviously really good with Soulsucker Lich, and it's a combo that in a lot of lines is unbeatable. You can't really interact with it. So Silent Strike, I think, is definitely good in the mirror, right? Because it potentially guarantees the game. And it's really good into mid-range because they can't really interact with you. But against aggro or sometimes in the control matchups, it's just so bad. But I think it's still just a necessary card for the deck to be. But who knows? Maybe even just looking at this, maybe we play 1 Silent Strike and 2 Flagrant Fouls. I could already sort of see where I might want to tweak some of the numbers. Flagrant Foul, definitely really good. Just, efficient 1-for-1 removal. Honestly, I could see playing 2. But in a meta with Liliana, Flagrant Foul isn't that good. So, and same with Teferi, right? You're not often going to be, needing a removal spell against Teferi in certain lines of play and how the games play out. Fearsome Return, you just want another way to animate things. Same with Ghoulcaller's Grimoire. I hate this card. I'm just going to say it now. I can't tell you how many times this card is just sitting in my hand the whole game. And then, maybe I use it once in a game. But I feel like in Liliana matchups, you're either going to win by turn 5, 6, or 7, or you're dead. And so, I really don't like this card. Personally, maybe it's a necessary evil. I think you've got enough ways to reanimate, personally. So this might be one of the cards that I feel like is worth cutting. But I'm going to trust Tino and the rest of my team who have, haven't really looked at these cards and said, oh, I think these are bad. So that's where I think they've got a bit more experience for sure. Grave Titan. I think this is a Tino edition. I'm sure other people thought about it, but I think they were the first person that showed me this. Grave Titan is definitely really important for the consistency of the deck. Now, it's important to note that Corpse Conveyor can mill that, right, over your Grimgrin or your Soulsilver Lich because you are opting to put another zombie in your deck. But it's 6 mana and it makes an extra body. A lot of times it's the card advantage, and it's like a reasonably costed creature, right? It's not 7 mana anymore, it's 6. It's just really helps with the consistency of the deck. And sometimes maybe if you're getting denied on your bigger creatures, Grave Titan gets the job done. Still a body that they kind of have to deal with. You're making it 2/2 every turn. You could jump block with it, you could apply pressure with it. I think Grave Titan is a really, really solid addition to the deck. And I think Ebon Death, which some builds had played, it's good when you cast it. It's terrible for reanimating. It's when you're yoinking something out of their graveyard, especially in the mirror. That card's insane. But it costs 8 mana, right? It's just for a deck that's already really on the precipice, I feel, of inconsistency. You don't want to add more variance into it. And then, obviously, the All-Star Grimgrin. This thing does so much work, especially against mid-range. If you ever get to resolve this and steal one of their creatures, like when you zombify it, I've had so many more concessions to Grimgrin, actually, than Soulsilver Lich, because people kind of know how to play around this or how to play with it. Grimgrin is really hard unless you're making, like, the best possible blocks and the best possible lines of play. It's really hard to play around this card. And then Soulsilver Lich, obviously, it's your turn 4 or 5 killer. It's why the deck has been such a menace for a long time. There's not a ton to say here in terms of matchups. I do think Liliana is powerful because she's just generally pretty good against the field. I think she can struggle with Teferi, but that's why you've got negates for those matchups. And it does definitely help, I'll say that much. Domri, who I was a big fan of, really struggles with this deck. A lot of other mid-range decks like a Johnny, right, really struggle with this deck. It's still definitely really powerful, and I know some people just really prefer to play it. If I'm picking between Liliana and Teferi, I'm playing Teferi, I think, 9 times out of 10. Sometimes I switch it up. But this deck just feels constantly way too inconsistent for me. That's maybe just my personal experience with it. So I don't want to, poo-poo the zombie slingers over here. But I do think that it's still a very, very, very powerful option, and a deck that if you haven't gotten to play with, it is like a different flavor of playing the game. So I think it's definitely worth picking up if you haven't tried it. And for those who are veteran players, I would say just take a look at the build and say, oh, are you running Grave Titan? Are you running Break Leg? Are you tweaking some of the numbers for different matchups? I think it's really important, especially when we think about wanting to climb into the upper echelon of Mythic, that you are metagaming a lot, that you're really thinking about how many matchups of particular Planeswalkers am I seeing, and what cards are dead, what cards are not dead, to really just increase your win percentage each time. And I had someone in my comments for a video the other day, which I totally get, of wow, I hit a string of unluckiness. I feel like there's so much RNG in this game. Why can't I get these wins? And I mean, that does happen. I mean, that is how card games kind of operate to some degree. But I think it's hard to overstate how important it is to metagame your decks, where you're really thinking about, is this card good 50% of the time, 30% of the time, 70% of the time? These are the questions you need to ask yourself if you want to be in the upper echelons of competitive play, because you need to be able to justify why your deck is built a certain way, and you have to be able to really look at the numbers and say, how am I going to gain percentage points in winning? What is that going to take, right? And it's not to get too hardcore about please have fun. That's the point of the game. But if you really, really want to just keep getting better and better and better, and that's just kind of my goal. I have a soft goal of top 20 every season now, but I would love to have rank 1 at some point. You just want to look at these small tweaks because they will give you edges in matchups. Even when I was playing Dahmer the other day and I was playing in the Logan's tournament, one of the turns I said, the only thing I could get devastated by and lose this game to is Lava Wave, right? And so I had my one of Infuser that I've had in that Domri deck forever because I really love Infuser in the green mid-range decks, especially with Drizzt. I think I talked about in a previous video. And I put +0/+2 on my Tarmogoyf to make sure that if they Lava Waved, it survives, and it had flying because I was playing Vivien, and it lived, right? It lived through the Lava Wave. I think my opponent had not even registered that that's what had happened there, and then I was able to win. Like, Infuser allowed me to win a game that I probably should have lost, right? So it's like, that's what I'm talking about, is when you make these small adjustments, they just can get you wins that you would not normally have had. And to me, I think that's a really cool skill expression for the game. So I'll get off my soapbox here, and I think talk about our last deck, which I'm really excited to bring a video. I think this week I'm really hoping to get that out there. We'll see. Things have been a little busy at work, but the last Planeswalker I would love to talk about because I think she's just really interesting in that it feels straightforward, but it's not so straightforward. And I genuinely feel that she is a contender for like top 3 Planeswalkers amongst Teferi and Liliana, and that is your girl Vivien. And for those who have not played Vivien, I'll just put up the deck list so folks can kind of peruse it while we're talking. She has an incredible amount of versatility, an incredible amount of kind of diversity to how you can play her. Sorry, I just wanted to highlight. So, in terms of her deck building, right, your deck can have up to 8 creatures of any colors, right? This is a really interesting deck building component. And in my Mu Yanling video, that's what I thought she had, and it's not that. It's just a regular splash. So a little bit of disappointment there. But to not get off track, Vivien has been a favorite for specifically Boss MTG on the team for a very, very long time, and has been like, sort of the church of Boss is converting everyone to Vivien. Also, I know Logan's really into Vivien as well, especially the more like kind of hasty like beatdown version. And I want to try that at some point. I've definitely just been running with Boss's Vivien for the last week or so. And I honestly found this deck super frustrating when I first played it. So I want to sort of like frame the conversation here as we close out with this last Planeswalker so y'all can go about the rest of your day, because I know this is going to be a long one, is that I think Liliana has a smaller barrier of entry to play. I would say the same with Teferi, although when you get into the mirrors, it's very complicated to some degree. Vivien, I think, has a big barrier to entry to understanding the deck. Like, when I played Vivien versus Domri, I was like, Domri's easy. All I got to do is just ramp, apply pressure, slam a big 8-drop, close the door, right? Vivien does not operate that way, at least with the build that we have. And you'll see some cards here that we'll spend a little time talking about, because I think there are definitely open slots in this deck. Please comment as well, like how you feel about some of these builds, because I really love to hear from the community what they think is best. So what Vivien is able to do is just get the most value out of every single creature that you play. That's her whole deal, and making essentially any creature into a threat. And that's why we'll first kind of start with Birds of Paradise, right? Which might seem awkward, because the way that Vivien, her play pattern, right, is you usually start turn 1, you use 1 mana to store an upgrade. That's pretty much what you're doing every single turn if you can. Birds of Paradise is kind of weird, right? Because it's not a creature that can really benefit from all the bonuses, right? Yes, it can benefit from the particular +3 or +0/+3. I think that's really it. I mean, armor, I guess you could use defensively. So it is a bit awkward, and you'll see in the Logan tournament that I had some really awkward lines with Birds of Paradise, so I'll be the first to say I don't know if it makes sense for Birds to be in the deck, but it is a card that gives you a free mana in a deck that, like, potentially in turn 6, right, you're getting a card and losing your mana. I think Birds is still a card I have a bit of a question mark about, but I would still start with it and see how you feel. And because sometimes also you can just like get the +3/+0 upgrade and play a 3/1 Birds, and that's really relevant for you. It's also something that can be a target for Briarhorn, and that also kind of makes it kind of interesting in how it plays. or for Stormforge Mystic for their upgrades, right? So there are ways of enabling Birds of Paradise to be more than what it looks like. But that's the only one drop you would play, right? Treetop Lookout, if you haven't learned by the million minutes we spent on Teferi, I think this card's really important. And I think there are lines of play where you can give a creature that you've been buffing and buffing sneak, right, or trample or something like that. You slam Treetop Lookout, Teferi can't use their combat-based traps to disrupt you. I just think if you're playing green, you probably have to play this card in a Teferi meta. It's kind of a necessary evil. And honestly, a 2-mana 3/2, it's not the best rate, but it's not the worst rate, right? Half the time, this will come in with a stat buff, and that'll be fine. Tarmogoyf gets really huge in this deck, right? You're running traps, you're running artifacts, you're running spells off of the Stoneforge Mystic. So it's really easy for Tarmogoyf to just be like a crazy efficient card. Beast Bonder, I think your best 1 and 2 play is to go first turn upgrade, second turn Beast Bonder. And this thing, giving this thing toughness, giving this thing evasion, flying early can just be incredibly devastating. 1 sec. Oh, we're almost there, Tim. Okay. Colonian Tusker should be in every good green mid-range aggro deck. Not much to say there. Grudge Match, same deal. Really important. Adaptive Frillneck. Now, I was not huge on this card. Boss has always had this in the build. And I'd played with some numbers, and I went back to his old build of 2 of this card. Not only does it have the versatility as a 2-mana 3/1 to draft an upgrade that it could really need, it doubles up on upgrades. So, you could just give it 2 upgrades, right, if you're using Vivien. And often, and I hope this will help explain how the deck runs, because I didn't quite register this when I first started playing it. To me, the best line is to go turn 1, upgrade, turn 2, 2-drop, turn 3, upgrade, 2-drop, right? So you're not strictly always going like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? A lot of times you're going like, that's why there are so many kind of 2-drops in this deck, is because a lot of times it's really beneficial for you to just go upgrade, 2-drop, upgrade, 2-drop, upgrade, 3-drop, upgrade, 4-drop, right? Because you're just getting so much value out of those turns. You can't always do that, but I think Adaptive Frillneck is why you running this is just super, super synergistic with the deck. And this thing can just be kind of a massive creature out of nowhere. And then you give it like armor, relentless, sneak, flying, trample. It gets really scary. Stoneforge Mystic, always an all-star. I would say the 3 most important upgrades, besides like the big stat buffs, are sneak, trample, and haste. I would say out of those 3, sneak and trample are the most important, because that's going to be how you close out games against, specifically Teferi, is just giving things the ability to just, they've maybe been sitting on the board, they're giant, you slam your Treetop Lookout so they can't affect you, you give your creature trample or sneak, close out the game. Arcbow. This card is kind of a dead card when it comes to aggro matchups, and sometimes mid-range matchups where they're pressuring you early, right? But this card is kind of a house in bigger mid-range decks and control. You're just getting, even though it's 3 mana, right, for 2 charges, you're just getting a lot of value out of it. And sometimes you have these explosive lines where you've got Beast Bonder, you're playing Adaptive Frillneck, and you're playing Vivien's Arcbow, and this thing's just getting like +2, +0, +3, +0 in a turn. And it just can be really backbreaking. Love Tracker. I've been a big fan of this card in Ajani, in Domri, but I also think it's got a really great home here. Not only is it a 3-drop that you can buff itself and become a more relevant creature, but just having the ability to play a creature that plays really well with upgrades, right, where your creatures are likely going to outtrade theirs. So it makes sense to be there. Worm's Wake, good for playing around Day of Judgment, good for buffing up your Tarmogoyfs, right, because it's a special trap card, and just making a 5/5 body where you can like hit your upgrade button, see what you hit, and you're like, oh, it's flying, sick. I'm gonna, instead of playing my Tusker, that I could have maybe given haste or something, I'm going to just prep my Worm's Wake trap and get a 5/5 flyer on my turn. Sounds good, right? So, Blighthoof Boar, just a big problem for a lot of decks to respond to. You give this thing haste, it's awesome. If this thing fights other things, it gets huge. There are definitely games where, like, I'll resolve this. It'll, like, fight with some stuff. It'll kind of be sitting there. It maybe trades with something. And then it, like, ends up being, like, a 10-3 or something like that over time. And then you just give this thing sneak or trample, and the game is over. So, like, that is a win condition in the deck that I hadn't really recognized when I first started playing the deck. And I hope some of this, just talking about my process with the deck helps y'all. Because when I picked this up, I really, really struggled to get, like, how am I supposed to do this? Maybe that's just because I'm, not as an adaptable, Magic Spellslingers player. But anyway, I hope it is helpful. Momir Vig, again, this thing is like pumping your Beast Bonder every turn as well, but like giving your Kraj an upgrade. And the way I usually play with Momir, obviously you hope to get an upgrade that can like keep him alive. And because he's usually pumping Kraj, what I will do as Kraj is getting bigger or more annoying is start pumping Momir, right? So that you're kind of like splitting the threat value. And so maybe you'll just use your Vivien Arcbow on Momir after Kraj has gotten 1 or 2 upgrades. So that's kind of like something that I've noticed in the games. Mistraven is just a really good card right now, right? Bounce is really relevant. Tempo is really relevant. A 5-mana 3/3 that bounces something that you can upgrade oftentimes, right, in Vivien is just really good. It's an evasive creature that can get buffed, and it puts your opponent behind. I can't tell you how many times you're developing and developing and developing. There's one turn where they need to have 1 extra creature, but they might not have it. You play Mistraven, you close the door. That's definitely something I've noticed. Briarhorn, I feel like when I first started seeing this card, I was like, man, I don't think this is that good. Yeah, it's 5-mana 4/4. Okay, sure, you can pump something, or worst case scenario, it's a 5-mana 7/7. Is that good? In this deck, it's that good. It just really puts things out of range of different cards. You put it on a boar, it's going to be really hard for them to ever fight it. Put it on a Birds of Paradise, right? Mentioned that earlier. It just can really, on any evasive threat, put it on your sneak creature that you got upgraded off of Stoneforge Mystic. It's definitely a really relevant card in the build. And last, but certainly not least, we've got Mr. Ulrich. Does a ton of work, as you saw from my Dahmer videos. This card's just such a house. 5-mana 5/5, haste. When you have extra mana gems, you're upgrading all of your creatures, which is crazy with Beast Bonder, right? Because it's getting +1/+0 for each upgrade. This card just usually comes out, beats something down, gets you a free card, and then if you're able to flip it and upgrade it, like, you should win that game. But even if you are, sort of vying for board position, right, and you're kind of trading it out with your opponent, and you play a 5/5 they have to, like, deal with, and then you get a card off of it. Worst case scenario, it said pay 5 mana, destroy, a 5-power creature, draw a creature. So, like, again, this is, like, when we talk about cards in your deck that are always good, this is one of them, right? Because no matter what sort of matchup, although, yes, in Teferi they can answer it in certain ways, right? Better than other matchups, other planeswalkers that you're playing against. Just the fail case, the floor of this card is a 5/5 that kills a 5-power creature, draws you a creature. It's just so good. And then the other cases that come up, are just like really, really powerful. So I don't think we want to forget about Ulrich here. So this deck is specifically trying to address Teferi. It's still a really, really hard matchup. I think that's why, like, a lot of people will probably choose Teferi over Vivien or choose Liliana over Vivien, because both of those decks, I think, are a little easier to pilot. The thing that I like about Vivien, although she can have some inconsistencies here and there, and I think I still need to do a bit of tuning with the deck, it just feels like you can play her and beat anything, right? Like, you're going to beat aggro, you're going to beat mid-range, you're going to struggle with control. You might struggle with Liliana, but you can beat it. So I feel like for anyone who's played, like, Jund in Modern, right, for any Reed Duke fans out there, it just feels like the fair deck that can get a few percentage win points here and there that you probably shouldn't have. And it's just kind of like this sort of hero deck that's trying to play the game very fairly, and when you pilot it well, can get there. I mean, Boss MTG has been playing this deck for a long time and has been sitting at rank 1 for quite a while. So, and yes, he plays other decks too, but I'm going to take his word for it that this deck is worth putting some time into, and God, is it fun to play. It's just your good old slug it out with creatures, get value off your creatures, get some really cool interactions with upgrades. It's just an incredibly fun deck to play, especially as someone who tends to go more towards aggro and mid-range strategies. And I wish I was picking Domri over this deck at this point, and I do play Domri here and there. I still really love that deck. But I think the green mid-range deck to play, I think it's Vivien. I think Vivien has ways of beating Teferi that Domri might not. I think it's still really close. Like, when you know how to play against Teferi, and you know how to bait what, and you know, okay, I can force them to wipe the board this turn and then refill the next turn, I think you can still win those games. But I think Vivien deserves to be up there within the current meta because of how she can beat up on Liliana, have some game against Teferi, and can beat up on a lot of the other decks. So those are the 3 Planeswalkers I wanted to talk about. We barely got through it, unfortunately, with my voice. But I really appreciate everyone's support of the channel. We're over 60 subscribers. We're definitely getting closer by the day to 100. And, I really just love all the support and am feeling even more and more motivated these days. I'm not sure why, but just to put out content and think about different things. And I definitely encourage you to check out, other streamers like Logan Thorne, other streamers like, I think it's like Small Cat or I'm a Cat, something like that. I'm sorry, I subscribed to them today, and now I'm blanking on it. But there are other people. Boss Blades, I think, puts out content too. There are plenty of other people who really want this game to continue on. I'm definitely one of them, and I hope that y'all can throw your support behind those folks, or at least be someone who's active in the Discord and just try to continue building this really great community for what I think is a game that has the function of you can pick up and play it on your phone, or if you're like me, I actually just love sitting down at my computer thinking about videos and just like grinding out games and playing different decks. So thank you so much, and we will catch you next time.